Hello, welcome in another important video. I hope you all are doing great. In this video, we will learn how to create our first ever API using Amazon API Gateway. Alright, but before we jump into creating our first ever API, let me quickly explain you how this entire flow will work. So imagine you are working on one website. Let's say this is your e-commerce website, and this e-com website will require front end. Okay, so you can choose any front end library or framework, let's say React.js, or maybe you can use Angular. So you will need front end. Another thing you will need is your backend. Okay, because your entire data is now stored is inside database, and this backend will help you to fetch that data, to enter new data into the database. Okay, so backend is nothing but communication layer between your database and your front end. From front end, you will send request to the backend. Backend will fetch data and then it will respond back. So we call it as an APIs. Okay, application programming interface. Okay, so this is how the entire structure looks like. So for now, let's imagine you will have to create an infrastructure for this entire application. So you can deploy your front-end application in separate server. You can deploy your backend application in separate server. Okay, so this is how usually we used to do earlier. But if you observe, there is one flaw in this entire process, and the flaw is whenever you are creating your backend server, you will have to maintain its scalability, its security. You will have to do a lot of work in order to keep your backend APIs maintained. So Amazon identified this problem and they come up with a solution. Okay, now the solution is Amazon API Gateway. Okay, so forget about this entire process now. We are not talking about front end in this API Gateway. We are specifically going to talk about backend. Okay, we still have database, we still have front end. Now let's see how this API Gateway will resolve our issues. So the way it works is, now instead of creating separate dedicated server for our backend, what we will do is we will create one Lambda function. Okay, so Lambda function is nothing but a function which works on serverless model. So if you don't know about serverless model, I will highly encourage you to watch our serverless video where you will understand how the serverless work and what it means. So just to give you high level overview, serverless is a new way, I can say, it's a new way of deploying your applications where you don't have to worry about creating servers, you don't have to worry about it scaling up, okay? You don't even have to worry about its security. It's a fully managed service, and Amazon takes care of maintaining security, maintaining scalability, and all the things that you need to maintain in any dedicated server. Okay, Lambda works on pay as you use model, where you will have to pay as per amount of resources you have used. So now the way it will work is we will create our API gateway. This is our API gateway, which we are going to talk about in a moment. So this is API gateway. Now front end will request API. This API will create Lambda function, and Lambda function will do job and it will respond back to API gateway, and then the communication will end. Now in this entire process, since we don't have to maintain a server, its security, now this becomes really scalable, easy to deploy, and you can get your application up to the speed within 4 to 5 minutes. Okay, so when we will create our API, you will understand how easy it is to deploy and create our first ever API. Let's just quickly recap this. Our front end will call APIs, which we will deploy in our API gateway, and that API gateway will call Lambda functions. So this is serverless. It will call database. If it is a fetch request, it will call database. If it is update request, it will update data in the database. If there is a delete request, there is a create request, then Lambda will do that job for you. So let's quickly see how we can create our first ever API using API Gateway. Just search for API Gateway. You will find it here. Let's click on this. Okay, now this is our first tab. We'll come back to this later on. Let's duplicate this console and let's search for Lambda. All right. So first of all, we will create our Lambda so that we can use that whenever we are creating our API. So let's go ahead and this is AWS Lambda console, and let's create one function. I'm going to keep this option selected. I'm not going to use any other option. So here you will have to define your function name. So let's say demo API. All right. And I'm going to use Node.js. If you want, you can use Python. You can use Go language, Java, .NET, any language in which you want to create your API. Okay. Now, inside the create role, I'm not gonna change anything at the moment. I don't even want to check any one of this option. Let's click on create. And here we have our Lambda function ready. All right. If you see code base, this is simple. There is one handler function which will ultimately returning one JSON, all right. So if I test this, let's create new event. Let's give it a name, test Lambda. And yeah, this is private. Let's save this and let me test this. So as you can see, we got response status 200 and body is also hello from Lambda. Okay. And this is what return in here. All right. So cool. We have our Lambda function ready. Let's go ahead and create our API then. All right. So this is API Getway console. And as you can see, currently I do not have any API. Let me show you. Yeah, I do not have any API. That's why there is no list. Okay. So in API Getway, we get three options. First is HTTP API, which we are going to be using. Another option is WebSocket API. So if you want to create any real-time communication, then you can use this WebSocket API. Then there is a REST API. Okay. And this REST API we will cover in our upcoming videos. And this REST API allows you to create API endpoints for fetching data, for creating data, updating data, and deleting data. We can say it is useful for CRUD operations. Let's get going and let's create our first ever HTTP API. Right. So I'm going to click on this build. So you get first option is integration. So the way it works is now we are working on this. Now we are working on this part where we are creating our API, but we will have to define what this API will do. What will happen if anyone call particular route. So in this integration, we get multiple options. So if I click on this, we get HTTP option and we get Lambda option. So we are going to go with Lambda. Okay, let's click on this. Now this will allows us to choose Lambda that we want to call if this API gets called. Okay, so again, if you don't find that Lambda function which we just created, we'll have to select appropriate region. So currently my region is Virginia, which is US East 1. I'll have to select that here, US East 1. Okay, and then only I'll be able to fetch my Lambda. Okay, so as you can see, currently I do not have multiple Lambdas. I only have demo underscore API, which we just created. I'm going to select that. Cool. Then it is asking to define API name. I'm going to give it a name demo API. Okay, and let's click on next. That's cool. All right. And I do not want to create any other route. So this is nothing but, let's say you want to create one API to fetch users detail. So you will create one user API. So you can create another route, give it a name as a user. Okay, and you can add another Lambda function in order to fetch your user information. But currently I do not want to complicate this setup, so that's why I'm going to keep only one API. Okay, and let's click on next. Okay, now this is asking for stage, so you can create multiple stages. So this is useful in the case when you have application in production and your development is still going on. So obviously you cannot check your changes in production, so in that case you can create pre-production like this, pre-prod stage. Okay, and then you can create production stage, and you can deploy on pre-production first, and then you can deploy onto the production. Okay, just for testing purpose. Currently we don't need those, so I'm going to keep this default, and the only thing I'll change, I'll not allow to auto deploy it. Okay, so click on next, and this auto deploy is nothing but as soon as we make changes, do we want to auto deploy it or do we want to manually deploy it? So I'm going to keep this option manual, so that's why I have unchecked this. Okay, and just click on next. Now check your details. Okay, and just click on next. All right, so as you can see, our API is now ready. So if you see on the routes, you will find there is a demo API, and if I click on this, so in the configure we already see this is an ID of my lambda function. Okay, you can change if you want. So you can see this is a demo API lambda function. So the meaning of this entire setup is whenever anyone call this API, my lambda function, which is this one, will get invoked and it will return response back as an API response. All right, so first of all, only change that I want to make here is, let's click on this any, or let's click on edit. I don't want to keep any, so I want to trigger this only when there is a get option. Okay, so you can keep any if you want. It doesn't matter if you call API using post put patch, it will call the same API. Okay, so but I don't want that. I want this API to be get called only when we use get method, so that's why I have kept this get selected. Now save this. Okay, so now our API gateway is ready. Now the question might have arisen in your mind. Now let's see how we can test this. Okay, so here you will see your API name. Just click on this and you will find one invoke URL. Okay, so in order to test this API, I'm going to use Postman. Okay, you can launch this Postman here. Go to the workspace, create new workspace. Okay, API demos. Click on next. Name, let's say test. Personal, create. Okay, so we can start testing our API using this Postman. So in case if you don't know what is Postman, Postman is API testing tool, and you will find multiple tools to test your API. If you are not comfortable with Postman, you can go ahead and use any tool. All right, so let me copy this URL and let me paste it here. Now if I call this, it will not respond anything. Okay, so it will say not found, and this is because our API is not set up on this route. Our route is different. Our route is demo API, so we'll have to paste this route in front of our domain. Let's click on send. You will see we got hello from Lambda, and this message that you see as a response, it is coming from the Lambda function which we have defined here. So let's say I want different message. Let's say if I change this message, demo message, and let me deploy this. So deployment is successful. Now if I call this API again, you will see your changed message. Okay, now We have covered this entire flow. Now only thing that you need to take care of is inside the Lambda function, you can define your own logic to fetch data from the database and respond as we just did it here. You can respond back your fetched data. So this is exercise for you guys. I hope you have enjoyed this entire video. I think that's it for this video. This video is already too long. That's it for this video. Thank you very much for watching. See you in the next video. Bye.